Before I begin, I want to tell the family that this is one of those video essays that became something of a rabbit hole. The more you dig, the deeper it goes, and the more interesting stuff that you come to, and it's been on my mind for a while now. The reason that I haven't gone forward with it is you got to be careful. There are certain subjects that black folks frankly don't handle very well, and I don't want to get into conspiracy corner because frankly when it comes to talking about how white supremacy moves behind the scenes, black people tend to substitute all sorts of spookism for the facts, and that doesn't help. As I've told you before, the United States has never been democratic, and that's not an accident. It wasn't meant to be democratic. When the Brits were running things, they didn't want a democracy, and when the English rebels decided to have their little brawl with one another, with one group of thugs gaining the upper hand over the other, these guys didn't want democracy either. Democracy is exactly what they want to avoid. The United States is and has always been a fascist state. That means corporate interests rule, and so-called government is merely a rubber stamp committee. That is the truest saying in the world, that government is the shadow cast by business. Sure, there will still be alleged congressmen and government departments, but these guys aren't where the real power lies. Their function will be to sign off on whatever the real power wants. And what the real power wants these days is to not be a de facto government. They want to be the government in all but name. Unquestionably, the functions of the government are being privatized. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's the thin end of the wedge. Without the people's knowledge or consent, you have corporations that are taking on more and more of what were previously the government's duties. From education to the military to national intelligence gathering and analysis. What goes unsaid, though, is that if the government is handing its functions over to private interests, then it's also handing its power over to these private interests as well. This is happening right in front of everyone. You have so-called members of the government who are themselves nothing but paid mouthpieces for this or that corporate interest who say this is what it's supposed to be. This is how Blackwater can roll into New Orleans, and without blinking an eyelash, they're automatically given quickie contracts to patrol the city. Now, there's a story that the white media didn't even bother to focus on. Basically, Jeremy Scahill was the only guy who actually bothered to report on it. Everybody else was just going, oh, well, we need more guns down here to control the niggers. And when you look at who it is who runs these private companies, you see that these guys are the same men who used to be in political office in many cases, and the same men who give donations to politicians in multi-million-dollar chunks. Off the top of my head, a good example would be Robert Mercer, the billionaire tech investor and hedge fund manager. He's the guy who put up the money to turn Breitbart into a going concern when Steve Bannon came in and took over. That was where Steve Bannon got the money from to make it where Breitbart became the white supremacist hub that it is today. It went from being just a white supremacist toilet to a white supremacist cesspool. It took big money to do that. It took Robert Mercer to do that. Now, another example, and this is one that we're going to be focusing on for most of this video essay, would be the Carlyle Group. I'm sure you've heard of them before. Michael Moore mentioned them in his documentary Fahrenheit 9/11. Now, the Carlyle Group claims to be a private equity firm, but when you look at who is in the Carlyle Group, you see a lot of big-name government officials from the United States and Europe. Former British Prime Minister John Major is part of the Carlyle Group. Former Secretary of State James Baker, who as Secretary of State was over the CIA. Former Secretary of Defense Frank Carlucci, who in that capacity was also over the Defense Intelligence Agency. He also did a stint working for the CIA. You have guys like R.J.R. Nabisco and IBM Chairman Lou Gerstner, who left IBM to head the Carlyle Group, and you got a ton of other individuals like that. Because as we all know, the most famous members of the Carlyle Group happens to be the Bush crime family. Poppy Bush and his son are members of the Carlyle Group. Well, you would look at that and think, this is just a bunch of right-wing zealots who set up their own little money laundering scheme. Now, while you could be easily forgiven for that misconception, after all, when you look at this gallery of rogues that populates the Carlyle Group, you see a bunch of right-wing luminaries. If, however, you think that the Carlyle Group is nothing but a bunch of far-right zealots, you would be wrong. George Soros is himself a Carlyle investor to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah, George Soros, who, if I needn't remind you, also used his money to start Black Lives Matters. See, ain't that what Neely Fuller said? White supremacy wants to control both sides of the argument, and the reason why is that is a basic tenet of warfare. How do you guarantee that you win a war? By controlling both sides. So you see, for white supremacists, there's no such thing as left wing or right wing. It's all white power, where the subject of controlling black people is concerned. That's the only true ideology that these white men with power have. After Michael Moore exposed the Bush crime family's connection to the Carlyle Group pretended to distance themselves from the Bushes, but it's commonly understood that the Bush crime family is as deep into the Carlyle Group as ever. According to Forbes magazine, the Carlyle Group has more private equity funds and investors and assets than any other firm in the country. The Carlyle Group owns 209 companies ranging from Hertz to Mrs. Fields Cookies. You can Google Carlyle's holdings, by the way. It's a who's who of name brand companies. Supreme Products, Getty Images, Veritas Software, among a ton of others. When you go to the Carlyle Group's own website to see the companies they own, it's just page after page after page of corporations and companies all over the world. The list of companies that the Carlyle Group owns is so long it's ridiculous. I think you're beginning to understand that the Carlyle Group has a lot of subsidiary companies that they run, but what they do goes way beyond financial scheming. These men are already wealthy. It's not money that they're after anymore. What they want are all the things money can't buy. For those of you who don't drool on your shoes, you'll recall the video essay I delivered recently regarding black men starting our own CIA. I briefly touched on private intelligence firms such as Fusion GPS and Stratfor, but I also briefly mentioned Booz Allen Hamilton, which was and remains one of the biggest and most influential companies in private intelligence. Edward Snowden, the man who absconded with all those secrets from the NSA, worked for Booz Allen. Well, you won't be surprised to learn that the Carlyle Group used to own Booz Allen Hamilton, and they made billions of dollars off of it. The Carlyle Group has made $2 billion off of Booz Allen, documented. Starting in 2014, however, the Carlyle Group began quietly divesting themselves of Booz Allen Hamilton stock, selling the last of its shares in December 2016. But that's not to say that they've cut ties with Booz Allen, because it seems a number of former Booz Allen alumni have been finding gainful employment in the Carlyle Group. Peter Clare is currently managing director of the Carlyle Group. He's also a member of the board of directors of Booz Allen Hamilton. Nolan Hart was a senior associate of Booz Allen from November 2014 to December 2016, when he left to become vice president of the Carlyle Group. He's only in his 30s, by the way, early 30s, might I add. Larry Pryor, former head of CSRA, one of the biggest information technology service providers in the world, and he left CRSA to join the Carlyle Group. Now, in all fairness, CSRA is not Booz Allen, nor is it a Booz Allen subsidiary. CSRA, however, is an intelligence and communications corporation that works for the U.S. government and U.S. military. But Larry Pryor is in the same orbit as the Booz Allen guys. That's the point that I'm trying to get across to you. Now, there's plenty of others, but I think you get the point. Now, why is the Carlyle Group snatching up all these people from Booz Allen when they used to own the company? Because the Carlyle Group wants to bring those functions totally in-house. Equity investment is merely how they finance their real goal, and for people like the Carlyle Group, that goal has always been control. See, you have a so-called equity firm run by former government intelligence officials and corporate giants who now have their own private intelligence company. There's nothing else that a reasonable person can call this other than fascism, one that works closely with the government, but also, since it's privately owned, doesn't have to disclose their own intelligence gathering operations. These men now have all the same power that they had in government, but now with practically none of the vulnerabilities, such as public oversight or restrictions. The Carlyle Group's acquisition of Booz Allen is one of the most notable, but hardly the only example. I'm simply using this as a case study of what's been going on across the board with these private intelligence companies, many of them using equity firms as a front, because that gives them global reach, gives them excuses to be all over the planet. But it also helps to pay the bills for their fascism expansion operations. Now, why is this important? It's because I want black men in particular to understand how the men who have always run things operate. Power is not governmental. It's not private sector either. Power is power. Now, you thought that the Bushes went away, that because they were no longer in political office, that also meant that they were no longer in control. This is why men like Robert Mercer have their own armies called private security companies, why they have their own intelligence services, which they call information technology providers. And it seems these days most every spy winds up working for one of these private companies. What goes unsaid, however, is that even those who currently work for the government tend to show the same professional courtesy to these corporate spies as they do to the ones in government. Because when half the intelligence analysis workload is being handled by private companies, and when the guys who run these companies put the politicians in office, it becomes obvious that certain corporations are merely auxiliaries of the government, though these days it seems the government is merely an auxiliary of these companies. These men are making it clear who the government really is. And as anyone who is an employee knows, you can't spend your career at just one company, so it's best to be on good terms with the folks who work at the other places that you inevitably are going to want to go to. More than half the people who work at the National Counterterrorism Center are contractors, employees for private companies. And most of these contractors started off working in the government before they decided to go to the private sector. This is what the world of intelligence has become, or rather what it's reverted back to. There's an interesting book that you might want to look into sometime called Her Majesty's Spy Master. It's a book about Queen Elizabeth I of England, and specifically Sir Francis Walsingham, who was, to all intents and purposes, her intelligence chief. The book happens to be full of a number of legerdemain of England in the post-Dark Ages period. I dare not call it a Renaissance, because nothing was reborn except for the rise of European venality. However, in the book, there's one little episode they talk about where a number of British merchants, well-to-do, wealthy merchants, decided that maybe they didn't like the way that Elizabeth I was running things, and maybe they need to be in charge. See, Guy Fawkes wasn't the only one who had his own plot to overthrow the British government. But these well-to-do merchants owned all kinds of seafront property, and their plot was that they were going to allow a foreign army's navy to dock on their beachfront property. I'm not making this up. Read the book. You'll see it. And that was one of the many plots that Francis Walsingham uncovered and was able to foil. But it just goes to show the idea of these private individuals, these wealthy men deciding that if they don't like the way things are going, they're going to overthrow the government. It's very old, hundreds of years old. If you want another example of private corporate interests deciding that they're going to run the government by force, all you have to do is look at the case of Smedley Butler. For those of you who don't know, Smedley Butler was a Marine Corps general, and he achieved the highest rank that a general could get. He's still, I believe to this day, he's still the highest decorated Marine officer who the U.S. military has ever had. And he wrote a book. He eventually became an anti-war activist, but the book that he wrote is War is a Racket. And the thing was published in 1935, and he was talking about how it became obvious to him that being sent all over the world, he was not putting down rebellions or dealing with insurgents. What he was doing was he was paving the way for corporate interests to get what they wanted. And he wrote all about it in his book. As he put it, Al Capone only worked in 3 states. I worked on 3 continents. He compared himself to a gangster because that's what he had been reduced to. But the real reason that Smedley Butler felt the need to unburden himself of all the sins he had committed was that shortly after Franklin Roosevelt took office, you had a bunch of corporations like Colgate, Firestone, and others who decided they wanted to overthrow the government. See, the kind of violent overthrows of government that happened in Japan with the super patriots, that happened in Germany with the National Socialists, that garbage where you got private individuals saying, we got to restore the greatness of the country, when what they're really doing is they're trying to seize power for themselves. That thing was tried in the United States too. And they went to Smedley Butler because, as the former head of the Marines, as the man who was the most decorated Marine officer ever, this man commanded enormous respect. And they wanted him to lead a group of soldiers to overthrow the government, a coup d'etat. Now, you might wonder, well, what did Franklin Roosevelt do? There was nothing Roosevelt could do. These corporations committed treason, bald-faced treason, and the president was helpless to do anything about them because he needed them more than they needed him. This is what private power has always been under the European. These men did not just recently decide that, hey, maybe power is best in our hands. It's been going on for hundreds of years, that you had private individuals trying to figure out how to overthrow the government and become a government unto themselves. And it's not as if this is some sort of secret. You need to understand just how deep this runs. The idea of those who have the money should be able to set up their own private intelligence services that they can use to spy on the government, to spy on you and me, for the exclusive benefit, for the unilateral power of a select few. And it's not as if the government doesn't know that. Money runs at the very heart of intelligence services. As black men, we are never going to gain the upper hand on white supremacy as long as we are waiting for the white media to bring us information. We got to get proactive across the board. The best information is first-hand information, not fourth-hand information told to you by a bunch of white supremacist idiots. As black men, we got to make that a point. If you are in a position where you've got financial wherewithal, at some point you're supposed to be looking and going, I want to know what the world's going on for my own interest and my own benefit. You cannot separate finance from intelligence gathering. You just can't. And by the way, if you think that this is just me whistling Dixie or that I'm kind of laying it on a little thick, consider this. In May 2007, the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency decided to hold a little confab, a little conference. But it was by invitation only. They invited mostly people from the private companies who the government now farms out its intelligence workload to. This conference involved a PowerPoint presentation given by a woman named Terry Everett. She was a senior procurement executive with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and her presentation, entitled Procuring the Future, involved her explaining to her colleagues what the makeup of the U.S. intelligence infrastructure was. Now, mind you, this was in 2007 that this little conference was held and this little presentation was delivered, over 11 years ago. One of her slides showed that a whopping 70% of the government's intelligence budget was being spent on contracts. As Everett's slides also showed, in 1998, government intelligence spent $18 billion on contracts. By 2006, it was $43.5 billion. So the U.S. government more than doubled the amount of money that it gave to these private corporations to carry out intelligence gathering and analysis, all in an 8-year period. And keep in mind, this started in 1998. At least that's where they track from. It's been going on long before that. But 1998, say, who was president in 1998? Oh, yeah, Bill Clinton. And didn't his wife, the shrew, talk about a vast right-wing conspiracy? Well, they ought to know they were the ones helping to fund it. And to put this all in perspective, Edward Snowden, who I mentioned earlier, was himself an intelligence contractor. According to The Atlantic, Edward Snowden made over $200,000 a year working for Booz Allen Hamilton. Compare that to the average salary for an intelligence analyst in government, which is only about $78,000. And you probably heard about the NSA leaker with the ridiculous name Reality Winner. She too worked for an intelligence contracting company. On a side note, white people are forever bitching and complaining about black children with weird names, but I didn't hear anyone talking about Reality Winner's name and how strange that is. Just saying. But even after Edward Snowden, even after Reality Winner, nobody on the left or the right has questioned the wisdom of outsourcing intelligence work. Nobody's looked at how much money has been spent, and nobody has asked what the hell are these private companies doing with all of this exclusive, high-level government intelligence that they're getting their hands on. Instead of bitching about Edward Snowden, you might want to ask what the men who run Booz Allen Hamilton have been doing with the information, because Edward Snowden was only interested in trying to tell people how much the government knows. It's what they do with it that ought to be of concern to you, because this is not being done by a government that you have oversight with. It's in the hands of men like Robert Mercer. We already know what they believe. These companies now know a lot of the government's dirty dealings, and when former CIA directors own these companies, well, you're not going to be putting this genie back in the bottle. And in a nice bit of truth in advertising, Miss Terry Everett, one of her slides, basically said what is the operating philosophy of all intelligence organizations. We can't spy if we can't buy. Now, folks, this is what a woman who worked for the Director of National Intelligence put up on a screen at a conference where there were a bunch of private intelligence corporations in attendance. This is what they're telling you. This is what they say behind the scenes when they think nobody's watching. All of that stuff about duty and honor, that's just what they say for the rubes, for the people dumb enough to believe that. In the real world, they understand. You're not going to be able to control the world without some sort of financing. You're not going to be able to learn the dirty dealings of other people if you can't afford to pay for that information. You're not going to be able to field spies and operatives all over the world. You're not going to be able to set up eyes and ears all over the world unless you have a means of paying those eyes and ears. You're not going to be able to get people's lips to open for you unless you got some money to pry those lips open. We can't spy if we can't buy. Intelligence gathering as a business transaction. It doesn't get much more blatant than that, folks. Your tax dollars at work. I hope that the point is a little more clearly understood. When I tell you that resources is the life's blood of an intelligence organization, I'm not just whistling Dixie. You had one of the government's main henchmen put on a private presentation where she told this gang of insiders that without money, they can't do spy work. You can't put it more blatantly than that, brothers. The bad guys understand what the point of having an economy is. Though given the pure idiocy that was on parade just a couple weeks back, I'm convinced that little tidbit would have flown right over some black people's heads. Now, this was at a government-sponsored event at which they brought private sector contractors. And do you want to guess how many black people were in attendance? I'm sure it was a nice round figure, 0. And believe it or not, this Everett woman's presentation, for a moment it was posted on the DIA's website, but it was soon taken down when they realized that people had noticed it. As soon as somebody realized what the world was going on and that it had made a couple of headlines, that, hey, look what the DIA is saying, all of a sudden they took it down. So they were fine with it as long as nobody noticed it. As white supremacy sees it, the biggest problem with democracy is that it's democratic. These guys don't want to serve government. They don't even want government to serve them. These private individuals want to be the government. But the government they want isn't a democracy or a republic, but a fascist plutocracy. Now, the reason I bring this all up isn't to feed your need for conspiracy theories. First of all, black people as a group can't really handle getting in depth about how white supremacy functions. I had planned for a little while to go in depth about Stratfor, but that's one that's simply going to have to wait. We're going to have to take this in steps. And secondly, the reason that I don't do too much on this isn't conspiracy theory. It's conspiracy fact. I'm not talking about something that I heard. I'm only showing you what I can prove. I'm not trying to impress you with the secrecy or the sophistication or layer upon layer of intrigue of white supremacy's spy capability. The reason that I tell you about this, the entire reason that I tell you about Booz Allen Hamilton and how the Carlyle Group owned them and their global reach, and how you have white supremacy admitting that it takes money in order to spy, the reason that I tell you about these private interests who want to take the government's functions and make sure that they have the exact same power is because, brothers, we need an equalizer. White supremacy has a weapon. We need one of our own. Or at the very least, we're going to need protection from their weapons. The white men who want true power don't believe in sharing it, not even with their own government. This is how the world is. White supremacy is the supreme power in this world. Deal with it. The white supremacists are in full control because we damn sure aren't. Denying that reality won't make it go away. It might make you feel better about your position, but it won't change your position. Seeing the world the way that it is, admitting to the world the way that it is, so that you can say it's not okay, that's what changes your position. I have no intention on placing my faith in the administrative arm of white supremacy. Even if the government was all black, hell, even if the government was all black first, nothing would change without resources. Nothing would get done without resources. That's the point that I'm trying to get across. Do not think that you're going to get black empowerment for free. Do not think that white supremacy is going to fall for free. Do not think that you're going to get your freedom for free. It's going to cost you. Now, you can wait until white supremacy decides that it should cost you your life, or you should decide that you're going to open up your wallet and that you're also going to open up your time for this. But you will pay for your freedom one way or the other. You will pay to fight white supremacy one way or the other. We chose to outsource our economic security to white power. Tell me, how's that working out for us? Are we so foolish, even at this late date, as to think that we can outsource our political and group security to white supremacy as well? We must have it all in our hands. I don't want to be trying to take information that I get from white supremacy's propaganda arm, and I got to sit here and discern it and sift through it and such. To an extent, when they're talking to themselves, that's worthwhile, but when it comes to knowing what's going on around the country where black folks are at, I should be getting that information from other black people. I can tell you right now, Robert Mercer doesn't decide that he's going to get his information from Fox News. The men who run the Carlyle Group, they don't believe in getting their information from CNBC. It's as simple as that. These men want the information for themselves. As was revealed in the documentary Fahrenheit 9/11, Poppy Bush takes advantage of a prerogative that few former presidents do, which is he still receives a daily presidential briefing. The same PDB, presidential daily briefing, that Donald Trump gets, former presidents have access to it as well. Most former presidents don't actually go for it because of the fact of what the hell you're going to do with it. But Poppy Bush does. And when you look at his position in the Carlyle Group, you got to wonder, how many times has he used this as insider information? He knows the stuff that's coming down the pike before anyone else does. But as a president, that's the kind of value that he brings to the group. Hey, I can tell you what the CIA just got through finding out. I can tell you what the DIA suspects. I can tell you what all these U.S. governmental foreign intelligence agencies believe in. This is information that only the president sees, and I got access to it. Yeah, you see how that kind of thing works now, don't you? But Robert Mercer doesn't believe in getting his information even from Poppy Bush. He believes in having his own eyes and his own ears out there gathering information for him. That's what he believes. That's what all of these white men with power believe. They're not going to, there's no honor among thieves, so trusting even their own white government, nah, they'll trust them to a point, but not to a fault. We need veto power over the administrative arm of white supremacy, over the government. We require veto power over them. Black men need to be able to nullify and cancel out the administrative arm of white supremacy. We don't just need an equalizer, we need the edge. We need an advantage, a clear advantage, an unassailable advantage. But that kind of advantage, the best kind of advantage, is inside information that you gathered yourself. There are some things that are simply too important to be left to any legislative body or to any gang of bureaucrats, no matter how dedicated or well-intentioned they may seem to be. Now, why is it that we don't have this already? Why is it that this is not the topic of discussion for black men constantly? Well, frankly, too many black men want to play helpless. We're not looking for power, we're looking for an excuse to hide behind so that we don't have to stop playing around and actually gathering power. The reality is this is because too many black men are lazy. They try to hide behind defeatist rhetoric because that's going to be their catch-all excuse. What's the old saying? If there's something that you really want, you'll find a way. And if you don't really want it, then what you'll find is an excuse. Well, we know where too many black men fall in that little discussion. As we all know, 99% of the time, I can't is usually a euphemism for I won't. We have the material resources. We just don't have them aggregated. Our lack of political will and economic discipline is the reason that the white supremacists are running amok. That's the reason why the mayonnaise monkeys are on a rampage. Because of the fact that we lack the political will and the economic discipline in order to put together organizations and institutions to fight white supremacy. We got the funds. We see the need, but we're sitting back deciding that, well, Professor Truth's going to do it. Well, this brother over here, he'll do it. Well, these brothers over here who are bringing it to our attention, they're going to do it. White supremacy is a group sport, not a solo act. Black empowerment is also a group sport, but unfortunately there aren't too many players on the field. Time for that to change. White supremacy has built entire systems of institutions, not just one institution, not just one think tank, not just one apparatus. White supremacy has built entire systems of institutions and then used their economy to incentivize the rank and file white folks to want to support these institutions. Why do you see so many white people who idolize Ivy Leaguers, the white ones anyway? Why do you see advertisers chasing after and catering to that educated demographic? Look at all the news programs, TV shows, and movies that present white people, financially well-off, established types, as a normal state. This is just what normal is. The message they deliver is clear. This is what a white person is, or at the very least, what a white person ought to aspire to be. This is why I tell my people to not become a fan of white media. When they call their media programming, that's exactly what it is. They indoctrinate you. As you see it, the point of the TV shows you watch is to entertain you, to make you laugh or cry, or to give you some sort of meaningful entertainment experience. But as the men who own the media see it, their job is to bypass your skepticism and reason. They don't see the shows that they put together as being TV shows or news shows. They see them as, well, the term that they use these days is media products. And what is the product that these media shows put together? It is to get you to drop your guard, to get you to lower your mental defenses, and to get you to open your mind and just take in whatever they're shoveling in, because the truth of the matter is you'll start off saying that this is BS, and before it's all over, you'll be lined up to see Black Panther, and you don't know why it is that you can't stop yourself. Oh, I've just got to see this. And when you look at how addicted black people are to white programming, you see that all of this white propaganda, all of this subtle brainwashing has worked. Black people will line up around the block for the new LeBrons, but they're not lining up to try to figure out how to get white supremacy on its knees. We saw the disgusting spectacle of black women lined up in order to buy hair weave from an Asian thug who knocked a black woman's face, knocked her face in, and instead of joining the black men who were protesting this violent Asian thug, instead the black women were lined up, I got to get my half off hair weave. You are putting money into the hands of somebody who assaults black women, somebody who doesn't do anything for black people, somebody who has shown that if he had his way, black women would be freely attacked in the streets. Because that's where our focus is. White supremacy is promoted and protected by the institutions that it has created. That's the reason why you create institutions. The so-called media is meant to indoctrinate you to deify those institutions, to worship the very organizations and apparatuses that white supremacy has established to empower itself and to disempower you. That's why institutions are created. Their purpose is to be cultural anchors. They are pillars of the culture. That's their job, to reinforce the culture. Why does their media spend so much time glorifying the institutions of white supremacy? Why the endless repetition of how great these white organizations and these white policies are? Why the endless parade of men in uniforms or portraying people who work for this or that agency or who went to this or that university as being better than everyone else? The reason that they do all of this endless repetition of the deifying of white institutions and white organizations is that in order to get people to be loyal to something, you have to get them to believe in it. That's why they show the images. They make sure that every time you see a soldier presented in uniform, always not a hair out of place, not a single strand frayed, not a single speck on the uniform. Oh, they make sure to use privileged angles, always shoot from a low vantage point so that the guy seems tall and powerful. You make sure that they're always presented as being these pristine examples of austere manhood. They make sure of that because they want to program you to believe in these institutions. They lambasted the Soviets because the Russians demanded that the people give everything to the state, run by communists. Of course, what went unsaid is that the so-called capitalists want the exact same thing, for people to give everything for the state run by capitalists. You get an education so you can better serve some corporation more effectively. And if you get a degree and go into government, well, as you see with the intelligence sphere, the only reason to go into government is so that you can get the type of specialized insider knowledge and training that will make you more effective when you inevitably leave to go work for a corporation, doing the same job, but for a lot more money. The so-called public sector was all but gutted long ago by private power, but the white powers that be have left just enough of the so-called public sector in place that they've actually fooled the public into thinking that they still have a government. And while the white media keeps people distracted with congressional sex scandals, or better yet, with this or that bad black man, or the back and forth between the two political puppet parties, no one seems to have noticed that the government has quietly handed over much of its functions and, in many cases, its power to private corporations, giving them the exact same authority that previously was reserved only for the government. And these new powers and functions aren't in the hands of some disinterested old men. It's in the hands of hardcore white supremacists like Eric Prince, founder of Blackwater, Robert Mercer, the billionaire tech investor bigot who bankrolls Breitbart, in the hands of the Bush crime family who orchestrated both the Willie Horton ad and the destruction of New Orleans, which cost over 1,200 lives, mostly black. Sure, Poppy Bush was former director of the CIA, and as Secretary of State, James Baker III was over the CIA, and now these men have their own personal intelligence agency. And what do you think they're doing with this intelligence agency? Do you think that they're just sitting back and going, well, this is going to help our stock investments? No, they're doing things in the real world. You have to wonder how many people have been killed as a result of these private organizations. You see, the CIA has 4 directorates. The Directorate of Administration, which runs the CIA, the Directorate of Science and Technology that creates the CIA's weapons and equipment, the Directorate of Intelligence, for all you Jack Ryan fans out there, that's what Jack Ryan was, an intelligence analyst. They analyze the information gathered, and finally you have the Directorate of Operations. Now, these are the men who are actually responsible for going out and doing the real spy work, like Valerie Plame. She was in the Directorate of Operations. Their job was to bribe people, cajole people, coerce them, blackmail. That's what their job was, to get information. But the Directorate of Operations, of course, does much more than that. When called upon, they perform break-ins, bombings, and assassinations. See, that's what the U.S. government has. Do you think that these private corporations, which have structured themselves along the same lines, you think these private intelligence services don't have a few individuals who know what it means to kill? You think that Eric Prince, when he hires all of these former special forces and all of these former army guys, you think he's the only one who hires individuals who are trained to kill? You think he's the only one? In the military, people have rank, E1, G1, O3, etc. And in government service, there's also civil rank as well, GS1 through GS15. This structuring is done in order to give standardization to the governmental and military apparatuses, but it's also done so that when people transition from the military to civil service, to civil service in the government, they know pretty much where they're going to land. The bureaucracy has a better idea of where to put someone who's transitioning from the military to civil service. And since government is the shadow cast by business, you also see a similar mirroring of structure in the private sector. And this is done so that whenever this or that bureaucrat has to deal with the private sector, they know who their corporate counterpart is. When people who work in the government get ready to transition to the private sector, they know where it is in the private sector that they're going to be. Sure, they don't use the same names as the government. They use different names, but they perform the same function. In order to facilitate their ability to work together, we see corporations structuring themselves more and more like the government, an administrative branch, an intelligence branch, a military branch, and even, of course, the propaganda arm. None of this is accidental. And this doesn't happen because all those former presidents and former congressmen and cabinet members prefer the structure of government. So much it's because they see themselves as having set up their own government. Now, brothers, we have to come to recognize these realities. The bad guys have an enormous head start, but we can catch up to them. Hell, we can overtake them. But this is going to require a massive and hyper-aggressive change in our priorities. And that begins with changing the discourse among black men. We don't need the majority of black men to go along with this. In fact, the majority of them aren't even desirable. Most people are sheep. Black people have proven themselves to be a lot of black sheep. What we require is merely a critical mass of the right black men. This is not going to come down to a numbers game. It's going to come down to willpower and organization. We don't need a ton of black men to do this, but we do require a critical mass of the right black men who have brought enough resources to inflict their will, as Jason Black beautifully put it. We've done it on a small scale and for limited objectives. This is fine in the beginning stages because we're only just getting started. But our aims, our ambitions, our thirst for power simply must become far more voracious. It must become all-consuming. The world we live in is one where the people who run things want power all in their own hands. The question is, do you? Show me where you put your resources, and I'll tell you whether you have any power at all. It's not wrong for you to want an intelligence agency of your own. You need one. It's not wrong for you to decide that you want to know what this guy over here is doing, especially when he's been spending 500 years attacking you. You're a damn fool if you don't sit there and say, you know what, I happen to be rather fixated on what this guy over here is doing because most of what he does is usually against me. There's nothing wrong with that. That's common sense. I told you about the book Gideon's Spies that starts off with the Jews in Palestine at the beginning of the 20th century being attacked by Arabs, and one of the things that they pointed out after one of these skirmishes with the Arabs was, have our people not always relied upon good intelligence? Yes, the Jews figured that out. Black people, on the other hand, haven't. Because you don't see any black organizations that are dedicated solely to intelligence gathering. We need a number of them, not just one. We need institutions that are dedicated to securing and preserving our power and being proactive about it. You don't wait until the barbarians are at the gate. The president who understood the most about intelligence gathering and how it was to be used was President Eisenhower. Now, a lot of people say that things were pretty quiet during Eisenhower's time, except for, of course, the Korean War. There's always that, though it wound down under his watch. But the truth of the matter is, Eisenhower understood how intelligence was to be used, and you know that he did because nothing happened. No, it's not that there weren't people who were trying to do stuff and groups that were trying to do things, but when you're on top of your game, what happens is nothing occurs. Your enemies are shut down before anyone knows that they're afoot, and that's what was put in Sun Tzu's The Art of War. The best thing of all is not to have means of repelling your enemy's attacks. It's best of all when you undermine and cut your enemy's gonads off before he even has a chance to do anything against you. When you're able to deal with him while he's still not even in the stages of forming his attack against you, when you can look at the guys on the opposing team and say, this one over here, take a look at him. Look at what he's done. Look at some of the things he says. You know, if this guy gets in a position of authority, he could be a real problem for us. You deal with him early when even his own friends don't realize that you just knocked out someone who could have been a big help to them. That's best of all. When you've dealt with problems before they even become problems, before they've even had a chance to take form, to the point that even your enemies don't realize that you've been doing things to undermine them, which is what white supremacy's been doing to us. We've had so many of our leaders knocked off, some of them overtly, Malcolm, and of course Fred Hampton were good examples of knocking off black leadership before it has a chance to form. But what about behind the scenes when white supremacy uses its money to buy off individuals and say, here are your leaders, to prop up a bunch of fakers, frauds, and phonies, to get us off point? Black Lives Matters. Yes, you can have D. Ray McKeeson telling you that the black community is a bunch of homophobes and that's what really matters. See, that's when intelligence gathering and intelligence work really takes full flower. It's not about how many bombs that you can plant. It's about making it where your enemies are blown off course before they can even do anything against you. And you know what? We need some of that. We don't merely need the desire to have our own intelligence gathering. We don't merely need the ability to do our own intelligence gathering. We've got to have that hunger that says, you know what, we got to stop white supremacy before its next assault against us, before it even takes form. Let's identify who the thought leaders of white supremacy are, the guys behind the scenes, the ones that you don't see. You know, guys like Robert Mercer. Let's take a look at these guys in depth. What can we do to undermine these guys? What can we do to neutralize these guys? What can we do to harry and harass these guys? What can we do to blunt their effectiveness and ultimately to undermine their ability to function? What can we do? Who do we got to talk to? Whose palms do we have to grease? I'm talking about a completely different way to think about power and its utilization. Because as long as black men think that they're going to get power for free, nothing's going to change. It won't. And as long as black men are more focused on the next football game and not interested in the game of power politics at all, nothing's going to change except for one thing. The numbers of black men are going to decrease drastically. Because you see, white supremacy is not playing any games. You may think that you have time for something else, but white supremacy, as far as they're concerned, they've got time for nothing else except you. We're going to see a thinning of the herd. We're going to see a lot of black folks getting bumped off. We're going to see a lot of black folks becoming casualties of this race war. And I can't feel too sorry for a lot of them because they suffer from the same problem Bill Cosby had. They had something better to do than to secure their safety and security. They had something better to do. And by the time they realized that white supremacy was now going to get around to them, it was too damn late. I'm not making excuses for what hasn't been done. I'm not going to be focusing on things that don't matter. I could give less than a damn whether or not Drake was at the Conor McGregor fight. The only interest that I would have in Conor McGregor is pointing out that Dana White is a scumbag who uses his little platform in order to show white supremacists, see, there are white guys here beating these black ones. He's nothing more than moral support for white supremacy. We can call that out, but the truth of the matter is he's got a company worth billions of dollars. And that company was built largely on the backs of black men, from Anderson Silva to John Jones. The problem isn't that we don't have the talent. The problem is we think that somebody else is going to do something for us. Let me tell you, when it comes to fighting white supremacy, nobody else is going to do intelligence gathering for you. Your good white liberals won't do it. You've been begging white liberals for 150 years to tattle on the white supremacists, and they ain't done it. You've been begging these good white liberals for 150 years to please feed us some information, tell us who the bad guys are, please name some names, and they ain't done it. And they're not going to. Because the exact same white privilege that Richard Spencer and Robert Mercer depend upon for their goodies and for every crumb of their daily bread is also the exact same white privilege that Bette Midler depends on, that Rose McGowan depends on, that George Clooney depends on, any other so-called white liberal you want to name. The exact same white privilege that tethers the white supremacists to their white skin giveaways and goodies and all of their white skin rewards is the exact same white privilege that anchors these white liberals to it. Oh, they'll give a tisk-tisk, but that's all they're doing. So the moral of the story here is you ain't waiting to see if some white person is going to come along and give you and feed you your next meal. You know you'll starve if you wait for that. Well, why the world would you sit around waiting for some good white folks to come along and to also spoon feed you your intelligence as well? You're going to have to learn how to farm for yourself. You're going to have to learn to choose the right plot of land. You're going to have to learn to choose the best seed. You're going to have to learn to plow that field, to sow the seeds properly. You're going to have to learn to be patient, to wait for those seeds to grow and mature and become the harvest. You're going to have to learn to also be preparing next year's harvest while you're gathering this one. That takes time, it takes effort, but here's the thing. We can learn it. We can pick up all these skills. There's no skill set that black men cannot pick up if we dedicate ourselves to it. We do not have a resource problem. We have a prioritization problem. And if you have not prioritized your survival, then you won't survive.